Alright, now I guess we're going to talk about empowerment, I guess you could say. And I get when you go into talking about Jennifer's Body with a different movie, the one that probably immediately comes to mind is Ginger Snaps, which is basically, like, not only does it feel like a similar setup, but like all of their story beats are pretty much the same. But I kind of just wanted to talk about Teeth anyway. Like, it kind of started from there. And then just that whole idea of this sort of women, or in this case, like high school girls, taking revenge in very graphic ways on the way that men can be towards them in this sort of general sense, and how it sort of captures that in this really over the top horror way, but has something kind of real, like really underneath it. Sometimes not so underneath. Sometimes it's a bit more present. But obviously, something like Jennifer's Body kind of got pushed to the side when it first came out because of the way it was marketed and the way it was sort of seen. And weirdly enough, apparently it wasn't until all the Weinstein stuff and the stuff after that that people seem to really start revisiting it seriously, because the whole aspect, like the stuff you can see in Teeth that it touches on, feel like they're already quite present. But it's just the marketing for it was so heavily in one direction that somehow a lot of people seemed blind to that for some reason. I know that Diablo Cody in particular was pretty pissed off about it basically being marketed toward dudes that wanted to bang Megan Fox, more or less, and how that's what all the marketing looked like, when it was really like this whole, I mean, you could say it's just, it could be a teen audience in general, male or female, but this, it seemed very much focused on just that, and not the whole idea of this would appeal to women and girls in a really specific way also. So, yeah, and we'll go into whether or not I feel like that completely redefines how I saw the movie back then versus now. But I do think I want to go into Teeth first, especially since it came out a year or two prior, coming out of Sundance, of all places, and making a huge impact there, and immediately becoming this really talked about thing. And of course, Teeth is one of those movies where I don't know that it has much of a reputation for being a good movie as it is the concept. But I remember even the first time I saw it, I was surprised by how actually good I thought it was. And it's one of those movies that you can chalk up to that whole thing where it's so identified by its concept and people's reactions to just hearing the concept, that it takes some convincing, like when you actually tell people. But it's actually kind of a genuinely good movie also. It's almost like they don't believe you how something this outlandish and this insane could be anything other than just that for the sake of that. And you'll notice Jennifer's Body is here, and I don't own a physical copy of Teeth because apparently they just generally don't exist. There was a DVD that Dimension put out. I know because I got it from Blockbuster when it first came out, so I've had one in my hands. But they are since out of print, and I don't think there was ever any type of Blu-ray release at all. I will say, I really wish I had the clout to campaign for something like this, because it just seems it seems like such a no-brainer. I really feel like Arrow should pick it up for a Blu-ray release, because it just really, not only is it a cult horror movie, but it just, in general, it just feels so much like it fits their brand. Like, I'm almost kind of can't believe that hasn't happened. So I feel like that would probably be our best bet to see an actual, like, legit physical release for Teeth, which it desperately needs. Because I'm pretty sure it's trending on, like, or trending, streaming on Amazon or something like that. So it's like, it's still being seen, like it's still available. But it also kind of feels like it's disappeared in a sense also, unless it's just not talked about in the circles I hang out in. But I do think it really should be. So to start with it, we do have our lead actress, who is Jess Weissler, who I kind of wish had... you still see her around quite a bit, and she had that small part as Audra in It Chapter 2, but still, this this should have been a role that was like really, like we should be seeing her everywhere and everybody should know her name. Rather than just being like, I'm pretty sure that's the actress that's Jessica Chastain's best friend in real life. She needs to be a little more than that, I think. And starting with this, where she's playing this character that, even though we get, our opening introduction to the potential dangers of her body in this very creepy scene with her and the younger version of her and her soon-to-be stepbrother in the pool outside, builds up what is eventually appears to be a repressed memory by both of them. But going forward now that this setup, and obviously most of us will know the setup going in, it's interesting but also probably not surprising to see that this character, Dawn, has become basically the full embodiment of purity, where she talks at these abstinence seminars and stuff like that, and just becomes this whole thing of never ever do it until you're married, and they have the purity rings and all that, and it's it in itself is almost there's almost like a creepiness, almost like a cult feel to that in itself. And even when they go to the movie theater and they're having a date afternoon, not even a date night, and they're just kind of analyzing the movie's ratings until they end up at even PG-13 seems too hardcore, so they end up at what appears to be, by the sound, just some generic animated movie. And that setting up this character goes into setting up the character of the stepbrother, who's not as present as far as screen time, but is basically the other side of this story. And now he's gone this completely, totally opposite direction. But what's interesting is how it is they've both been sort of scarred by what she has. Because while both of them seem to have completely suppressed the memory, he does seem to be, there's something in the back of his mind where obviously he's physically scarred on his finger, but also apparently mentally in a way that he doesn't seem to understand right away, because he doesn't remember that incident clearly. The fact that he is he he deals exclusively in anal sex with this girl that he has just laying around the house. So it's clear that his subconscious is avoiding something traumatic. And how the idea that both of these characters are coming from a certain traumatic place, with her having this condition itself, versus somebody that was affected by it. So it is a bit more double-sided in its approach than it might seem. It might, on the surface, if you say, oh, this is the concept and there's a clear allegory here, people will just say, oh yeah, it's about how, how much of a piece of shit men are and how rapey a lot of them are. But it's a little more double-sided than that. And what's interesting about that especially is the fact that the stepbrother is clearly an antagonist. But the fact that it shows how trauma can go also is really interesting. But I guess it doesn't work to make him too sympathetic in case that becomes a worry, because eventually this is all, it might seem like a sort of just general revenge kind of thing, but then eventually it does get into a more specific type of revenge, which we'll get to. But I think the other thing also that seems to really draw attention to, apart from, both sides being traumatized, is how warped perceptions can happen with stuff like this, especially with the whole idea of her getting into these, abstinence things, and how it, completely, her fantasies are, her sexual fantasies are 90% wedding. Because obviously that is would eventually be the transition into this finally happening to her, but getting that sense also on top of the fact that the brother is only into anal. That whole thing about how it's stuff like this, starting from childhood, can just really get into your mind and completely warp the way you see, in particular, sexuality, which the movie does some interesting things with as far as going to that. And then the whole idea of this idea that one thing seems more acceptable in society than the other, like the nipple debate, For instance, how one is apparently normal and can just be flaunted, if you want to call it that, versus one is just seen as completely obscene and must be censored at all times. Of course, the more, desirable, and I think men or women will tell you that, that the one that's significantly more attractive and appealing is the one that is blocked off from the world. And they demonstrate this especially at the beginning of the movie when they go into when they're in school and they're doing, anatomy, and the, dick diagram is there just in plain sight, and the vagina diagram has been covered up with this very large sticker, which is something I never experienced in school, but I could, like, the more you hear about things and the more people get bent out of shape about the weirdest shit, which says more about their psyche than anything else. Like, it's gotten to this point. Remember, this movie's like 2007, 2008. But it's like you can imagine certain schools and certain districts like resorting to that, and probably even crazier shit in real life. And so that's clearly like you can say allegory, but it's like it's all out here in the open. I wouldn't call it does have, like it puts its concept forward and it clearly plays itself up as this really twisted horror movie with this wild idea, but it's also not exact. Like, you can have some stuff underlying that, but I would hardly call Teeth subtle. But this is yeah, the idea of approaching it as horror after we set up this whole thing, because it's a while in. Like, they do a lot of the character setup and a lot of where they're coming from. Like I said, what trauma has done to them and how it's warped their perceptions. But yes, eventually with this concept, of course, we're going to get an insane movie, especially when the gore kicks in. Gore that you will be... It's surprising how much of it is on screen. But yeah, that's that whole thing also, where it's... that like, the idea of the gore that we see, but of... We talked before, when I did the Night of the Demons video and the Prom Night 2, about how eventually horror movies get this point to where, especially when they have a certain concept, at some point in the midpoint, they will completely embrace the crazy, and you can tell when it embraces the crazy, and then that's where it's going to go from there. Where it's like, once we get this one scene that takes us to the other side, we don't know what to expect when it goes from there, when we see how far it's willing to go based on the scene that takes us there, and then the subsequent ones. And I guess you could say, quite easily, the moment where the movie embraces the crazy is the first time this takes place. When she's been going out with this dude that seems nice, which is going to be a trend, of course. And then, because both of them have been abstinent, he's apparently reached a breaking point. And they've gotten... like, they can only get to a certain amount of fun before he must go all the way, which she is not ready for, and of course that is what makes her condition react. And I remember being quite surprised the first time I saw it, when we actually see the wound in pretty much specific detail, and the gore that follows. And I do think it's interesting that we talk about the whole thing about how it's acceptable to see one thing but not another. How you can see the severed dicks on the ground, and you can see the gaping wounds on their body. But the one thing we don't see in detail in this movie is the teeth. And of course, the reason for that is if you get so much even a glimpse of vulva, there goes your R rating. So that'll, like, the whole, what we actually see in the movie and what they were allowed to show in the movie itself reflects that whole thing about the ridiculousness of, like, this thing is okay, but this thing is apparently not. It's like, I think the only way you can get the type of shot that would be required to see the teeth is only allowed in, like, birthing scenes. And that otherwise your rating is gone, and you basically have no release at all. So that's like, I don't know how intentional that may have been, or if how much that was in the filmmakers' minds as they were going, but yeah, the whole execution of the movie itself just kind of does that seemingly unintentionally, shows the whole theme that it's going for. And naturally, there's going to be this balance that's going on, because you can have a straight horror movie, and you can have these moments that are like genuinely horrific, but then they also have this underlying thing that's horrific in its own right. The idea of women being, women having this constant fear that they could potentially be raped, even by people that they trust, or people that seem trustworthy. And I guess you could say the general fear of dudes losing this is like the worst thing. Like, it's like suicide worthy almost. But obviously, with this kind of concept, if you don't go and embrace the potential comedic value here, it's gonna be, it would be really hard to capture that tone. Like, if you have a concept that's over the top, you're gonna have beats in it that have a sort of darkly comedic vibe to them, and the way they embrace that without really sacrificing anything they've already built up is interesting and kind of skillful. Like, sometimes it's stuff like when she's doing her research and she's starting to see, the history behind it and the fact that it's real, and it's played up in this very like comically dramatic way. And then there's the point eventually where she's reached another person that seemed trustworthy, in Ryan, I believe his name is, which is funny because apparently even if, guys named Ryan seem as trustworthy as possible, they're likely not. And if you know which movie from last year I'm talking about, then you know which movie from last year I'm talking about. And then when he actually apparently survives and they're doing the surgery, there's that throwaway line that the surgeon says about seems hardly worth it. And it's like beats like that, where it's like kind of embracing the fact of how absurd the concept is, despite being apparently a real myth somehow. But and that's another thing also, where when you look into that, like, it's kind of insane that it took until like 2007 for somebody to say that could be a totally insane movie. Like, if it's a myth that's been around for like hundreds of years, you would think that would have come up in a movie by now. And as far as I know there's you can find horror shit everywhere in any like nook and cranny of any sort of place where you might find some throwaway movie. So they could be out there, but as far as like this apparently being the only one on the surface, it's like unless it's because everybody, even the people that would venture out to make some insane movie just for the sake of it, even they were like, how do you even approach doing a movie like that? And it's like the whole idea of, is it a horror movie? Is it a comedy? What could you possibly do? And how? And it does seem like, allegories would have to be inevitable at this point, as far as having a concept like this. And being able to find the balance to do all of those at once is very, especially when it has the emotional beats, especially involving her mother, who is dying, and then eventually we do reach that point where that reaches an emotional peak, which is about the time our revenge portion of our like specific revenge portion sets in. And the way it's able to balance, having tongue-in-cheek moments, but then have the moments where she's like actually mourning her mom. Even that shot of like the nurse standing outside mourning with them, giving you that idea that she's probably been in and out of this for quite some time. And then just the coldness of seeing what probably eventually got her killed. The fact that she had collapsed and the brother did absolutely nothing about it, and was busy getting laid again, because that's pretty much most of what his screen time is. Another thing where he's kind of repressing his whole fixation on Dawn. So there's a whole really fucked up and twisted thing going on here. And the way they are able to approach that, but also have this like camp factor to it. And the way that sometimes they double up on that and kind of do it at the same time. Because there is a scene that is quite you know, terrifying in a sense, because it's very much like a scene we just talked about in The Hand That Rocks the Cradle, a movie that was played completely and totally deathly serious and totally. Um, but the thing here is the idea of it's weird to me. Like it didn't occur to me until I was rewatching Teeth, where it was talking about two movies so close together that has a scene where a gynecologist takes his glove off before going in, and how like repulsive that is. And taking something like that and being able to make this scene that feels so over the top and like almost comedic about itself, or probably intentionally comedic about itself, where Josh Plyce loses a few fingers naturally, and he's kind of the. We see that shot of him also getting his fingers surgically put back on, where he absolutely refuses to say what happened, and how that kind of eventually is mirrored by the scene with Ryan getting surgery also. There is, like, it really embraces the absurdity and somehow manages to keep the emotion intact. And really the other way around, you can say it keeps it's really got emotional beats, but somehow the more over-the-top stuff and the more campy stuff somehow isn't really affected by this. And I think it's just because they struck gold with such an outlandish concept, to where it's like you really... Your mind is clearly already open if you're even going into a movie like this. So it's like, if it wants to be this thing, you pretty much just accept that, and if it wants to be this thing, you pretty much just run with it. Because if you go into this, you're ready to run with whatever is here, I would think. And then, yeah, we do actually get... even when it like touches on the real territory and the real fears in this really over-the-top fashion, it manages to actually work. And I think having some characters on the side actually kind of helps to ground it a little bit. Like, I really like the idea of, despite all of this, that the stepdad is actually like a genuinely good dude. Because it's one of those things where you kind of expect her to be surrounded by dudes that are, you know, predatory, but that the stepdad actually comes through and is like kind of the one sort of saving grace in her life, really. Especially just in general, how real life and movies have this thing about building up stepdads to be this really potentially sinister thing. But so it almost feels like this sort of intentional twist on that. That the dad is actually a good dude, and the one sort of factor in her life besides her mom that's sort of grounding this whole thing. The actor being Lenny Von Dolan, who is great, who you may know from Twin Peaks or Home Alone 3, depending on where your tastes lie, or both, if you're into that. But yes, but then eventually it does become an ultimate revenge movie where the brother finally gets what he wants, and Dawn gets her justice for him essentially causing the death of her mother. And I love the fact that it's basically the same outcome, where she basically leaves him for dead the way that he did her mom. And then this whole ending where she seems to be fleeing this whole thing, and we see that like it almost seems like now that justice has been served, maybe there is some sort of path that she can find. Because we do learn with Ryan that it can be controlled as long as she wants it. But then there is this sort of epilogue where it's like maybe she can, you know, finally get through this and not have to do this anymore. Like it was like the brother was the last thing that needed to be done, as far as something like this. As far as like having to intentionally use it as a weapon. But then, unsurprisingly, she finds herself in these situations, and she can go as far away as possible, and she will still run into somebody that is totally and completely predatory. I love the fact that the whole scene with the old dude in the car is done completely without dialogue, which is really great, and gives it like this great sort of final ending that shows if it comes to that, then by all means make it a weapon. And then that's... Yeah, and I've always found this movie like so incredibly satisfying in how it was able to do all these different things and like take all these things that just do not mesh whatsoever, and somehow making them into this really wild and twisted movie. that has a lot of setups and then very satisfying payoffs throughout, and balances allegory and camp and this in the serious issues involving like her mom and stuff like that, the real life territory. And like even the shady gynecologist is a character that could be very very real. On top of all the other rapey dudes that are in her life that she actually knows personally. And yeah, so it's weird to me that this like it's probably weird to most people that this movie exists, but I think the fact that it exists and that it's done so well is the really weird thing. And that has always drawn me into it. So it doesn't seem to have a reputation as far as I know, at least as far as the little that I've heard, for being a movie that's as well done as it is. People just say, oh, that's a movie with that crazy concept, and then that's just pretty much it. When it definitely rises above that, I think. But that's the way some things turn out. So, like I was saying, I don't know that I feel Jennifer's Body accomplishes that as well as far as, like, allegories mixing with the camp and the monster movie and stuff like that. But we can talk about it and see where we land. And so the idea of, first off, Diablo Cody having just won her Oscar for Juno, this was her follow-up script, which was very jarring at the time, but still has very much her sort of signature dialogue in it. And the director, who is not Jason Reitman now, is Karen Kusama, who had done Girl Fight, and then would go on to do like The Invitation and Destroyer, the Nicole Kidman movie. Destroyer also kind of being its own twisted revenge movie in its own right. But this one, as we were saying, was marketed as this monster movie that had Megan Fox all over. And of course Megan Fox was like fresh off of, this was the same year as the second Transformers, and the first was just a couple of years prior. And that was pretty much, like, Megan Fox is basically the way Michael Bay shoots his women basically became Megan Fox's whole screen presence in general, and that's the way people saw her and how she was dismissed as being like a bad actress and was only there for eye candy and stuff like that. And this movie appeared to be just cashing in on that, and the whole marketing was just, hey, all the dudes that want to bang Megan Fox, here's this movie where she's, teasing nude scenes that don't actually happen and being just generally seductive, but it's also a gory horror movie, so obviously that has mass appeal just in general. But obviously, especially now, but like we were saying, even back then, it had a little more going on in the allegory department. But before we get into that, the first thing I think I want to mention is, while I was on that train with many people, where I didn't care for this movie when I saw it in 2009, really at all. It just kind of seemed like another, monster movie aimed at teenagers, and then it just came and went, and I didn't really think about it one way or the other. But I think one thing that might be off-putting immediately, as far as it being seen as not a good movie, is the intro. The opening is all over the fucking place, where, like, just from a storytelling perspective, before we get into anything else, this throws at us, it's Jennifer on her bed, and then Amanda Seyfried is out the window looking sinister as fuck, and then we fast forward to Amanda Seyfried being institutionalized, and we get this for a while. And we don't know exactly why she's here or how this character would get to this point, especially if we've seen enough marketing to know the kind of character that Seyfried is playing. It's like, how the hell did it come to this? Which, of course, we will wait for the movie to tell us, but then it jumps to getting a bit of town history, where we learn about, the vortex and all that. That goes to a supposedly some mysterious place, and just the general bits about the town and the waterfall and all that. And then we get Jennifer's official introduction, and then the movie picks up from there. It's like, as far as like drawing us in story-wise, that's throwing a lot at us that doesn't make sense. And it's one of those cases where it's throwing so much at us, when it starts to piece together at the end, are we even going to remember all of this that was just bombarded at us in this first, 5 or 10 minutes? And how it's just like, and it's not, and there are cases where it builds up, like, for a mystery factor, where it's like, oh, I'm intrigued as an audience member about how it all comes to this. But we don't even know, like, there's no seemingly particular order to this, but it's not really done in the way that seems intentional, where it's like, let's draw in the audience and have them try to piece together what is going on in this first 5 or 10 minutes. It's just, yeah, it just doesn't work from a storytelling perspective. But if you're decide to just dismiss that and then pick it up where we're introduced to Jennifer and then Needy, and then we go to the story as we know it, because it doesn't even really do a circle back around thing. It does briefly just enough to show us Needy breaking out, but that is a very, very long time away. So, to get back here, like we were saying, there is, Juno-esque dialogue everywhere where it was almost like Diablo Cody was making her own language, where it's like, I still to this day don't know how much of this was real slang. This or Juno, how much is real slang and how much was Diablo Cody like making her own original dialogue, and the way characters speak, and kind of like in being in their own world, like living in their own world, it's interesting as far as like building characters and establishing a setting, which is great as far as like from a writer's perspective of how Cody approached that. But still, there's a lot of character introductions that seem rather pointless, because they're characters that we either don't come back to at all, or just serve like a really small purpose, or just eventually to die. Sometimes for us to think they're dead, only for them to eventually die like 5 minutes later. And the whole thing feels not as all over the place as the intro, but it feels all over the damn place. And we introduce Chris Pratt back when I want to say Wanted was like the only other thing I felt like I'd seen him in by then. Who plays a crucial role, but he's also a character that seemingly I don't recall ever seeing him again after this scene at the bar. Because obviously he's established that technically he's the reason all this gets set off, because he's the reason that Jennifer's not a virgin. But that's, like I said, that's about as far as characters go in this, apart from Jennifer and Needy. But even then, a lot of this is based on their friendship that started in childhood, some of which we see. But there still doesn't seem to be much of a connection there, and I don't think it's helped either by the fact that they're supposed to be total opposites, in the sense that Jennifer's the one that everybody wants and everybody desires, and then Needy's like the one that's just there, the one that doesn't have everybody going after her. And it's like the thing where it's like, to make Amanda Seyfried seem undesirable, they basically just put glasses on her and put her next to Megan Fox. But honestly, if anything, putting glasses on Amanda Seyfried makes her look even better. So that in itself was that thing where it's like movie ugly, if you want to call it that. Like there's even a point in time where they're talking about how when Jennifer hasn't been feeding, she starts to look like really sick and uglier. But I think somebody even says like, yeah, ugly for her, which still just kind of looks like Megan Fox. So all of that is asking a lot of the audience to buy. So there is that. And I know we've been dealing with that forever, like the whole "she's all that" syndrome, where it's very hard to uglify actresses who are far from ugly. And this movie tries it twice with two different people that are pretty much impossible to make ugly. So that in itself is just a giant flaw waiting to happen. But as far as what it is doing well, like as far as like Megan Fox's performance, for instance, where obviously she had a lot to prove at the time, because people just saw Transformers and were like, oh, that's all she is, she's eye candy and stuff like that, the stuff we talked about. But she does have a certain factor here where it's like, she does more as far as like playing the ultimate desirable person, more than just existing. Like there is something here, whether it be like the way she portrays like the general surface of Jennifer's personality kind of goes a long way. And then when has to embrace the evil part of her, like that smile that she does when we first realize that she's possessed, is pretty effectively sinister, which is great. And like like I said, I feel like there should be more to Jennifer and Needy's relationship here, because it is, like, I feel like it's much more talked about in dialogue than it is us actually seeing it play out. Which can make it feel a bit thinner than it's probably supposed to be, because obviously that's going to be a pretty big driving force throughout the movie also. So the things that are keeping them separate and the things that are keeping them together, both of those feel quite vague, as far as the way they're presented in the movie itself. But as far as like going further into the dialogue aspect and the way it sort of, builds characters and an environment from the ground up almost single-handedly is great. But it does, and I don't know if it's just because we were post-Juno, and, like, Juno was the novelty, and then by this point the novelty was kind of starting to wear off. But it does feel a little more forced here, as far as, like, the terminology kind of feeling like its own thing in its own language. There are moments where it's surprisingly poetic and effective. Like the moment when she compares Adam Brody to a petrified tree is surprisingly kind of poetic. But for the most part, it is just sort of like almost like the movie needs its own dictionary. And once again, that was the appeal of the Juno dialogue. And it may have been kind of losing its way here, and you can almost see where it's like she was almost kind of trying to recapture herself, and it wasn't quite there. But and that's the way it goes sometimes when you have to follow up something so great, something that wins you an Oscar no less. That could be. I may have heard something about how she may have potentially written this first, or they were written very close together, obviously, because the movies are only 2 years apart. But it does feel like all the stuff that she had, like, either way, it lines up. Like, if she wrote Juno first, then it was like the novelty kind of wore off. But if she wrote this first, then it was like she tried it here and then ultimately mastered it in Juno. So either way, it feels like Jennifer Swan is kind of getting the shit into the stick as far as how the dialogue turned out. But it's not as bad as, like, it's clear how talented of a writer Cody is, even if the dialogue doesn't always land. Like I said, just the way of building a whole world in itself with it is pretty remarkable, so it does have that going for it. And of course we do meet this very sinister band, and this is when we can start getting kind of allegory heavy. And once again, sometimes maybe unintentionally, sometimes it may have been, you would say future events, that it ultimately kind of helps the movie catch up to where people were like, oh, this movie was saying something. But I mean, even before all the Weinstein stuff came out, like, everybody knew that whole thing about, the dark side of Hollywood and how people were used and abused and stuff like that. But it seemed to be all those scandals coming out, like, all at one time in that era is when it kind of resurfaced the fact that this movie is about dudes that sacrifice a woman's body to further their careers. And the whole idea of how Adam Brody's saying, like, we've literally tried everything, so Satan is basically our final option. So we're going to try Satan, which means we have to sacrifice you. Which, of course, goes horribly wrong and horribly backfires. And worth noting that Adam Brody is also great in this with his limited screen time, and the way he plays up that really sleazy, immediately untrustworthy vibe. And sometimes small things, like, obviously there are times where he can come off a bit rapey, but then there's just the smaller things, like the fact that he calls Devil's Kettle Devil's Lake mistakenly, not once, but twice. And it's like, by the time he does it the second time, it's like, oh, I'm beginning to think this guy's a piece of shit. Like, even the whole, aside the whole sacrificing a girl to further his career to Satan, yeah, you just get those vibes of there's just something wrong with this guy. I think there's something off about him, even if he wasn't sinister and murderous. So that whole thing, but at the same time, that does bring about questions, and maybe I'm just totally missing the boat on this entire movie, which would be tragic since I've already talked about it this long. That would be embarrassing, but I do have, like, questions as far as its approach to its whole revenge angle, because I guess the way I've been looking at it is she just kind of takes on the general predatory vibe that generally is seen with guys, where it's like how as long as like men and women exist, there will be dudes that are just naturally predatory, and that's what they do, and how women can feel unsafe. Like I said, whether they trust a dude or not, which we talked about already in Teeth, but and other movies, but so taking on that vibe of like no guy is safe once Jennifer is possessed, because the victims seem somewhat random. By the time we get to Colin Gray, it's more of this whole thing of like her fascination with Needy and a sort of jealousy, and how there's a whole potential thing going on as far as like exploring sexuality and stuff like that, and where Jennifer's desires lie and how fixated she is to the point that she will go after anybody that, you know, might actually see Needy as desirable, or in like Chip's case, the person she's actually with, and that just sort of, you know, whole thing. But I feel like it's a weird case of revenge movie, because like even Diablo Cody was saying, it's a revenge movie. The fact that the movie is not about her going after the band has always been kind of weird to me. How they're literally just a mid-credits epilogue. And it's not even Jennifer. It's Needy that takes them out, like, after everything has happened. And it's like, I remember the first time I saw the movie, I had assumed that when she reappeared for the first time after being possessed at Needy's house, that she had killed the band that night, like, when the whole thing happened. And it was weird to me when it was revealed that, no, they're just still alive. It's very unceremoniously revealed, no, they're fine. But especially weird given that obviously the ritual did not go as planned. But yeah, I mean, maybe it would have been, you know, obvious and kind of generic, but I mean, it already feels kind of generic anyway, even with this underlying stuff. But yeah, it's weird to me that the movie is just not her victims being the band one at a time. Ultimately leading up to Adam Brody being the last one. That seems like what the movie's setting up. Like I said, maybe it's a whole thing about just general predatory nature that doesn't necessarily have specific targets, that just kind of exists in general. Maybe. Like I said, maybe I'm totally missing what's going on here, but we do have other things in here that it's touching on. Like the whole idea of how all this stuff seems to be happening with just really out of touch and kind of emotionless adults around, really not having any impact on anything. Like J.K. Simmons' teacher is very funny and gets some very funny dialogue, and Amy Sedaris is here as Needy's just like pretty much absent mother, and how all this stuff is just able to happen with all this, like the whole idea of like that old cliche of where are your kids at like 2 in the morning and shit like that. Those old weird PSAs that would play in the middle of the night. And there's also something about grieving that you can look at that does have kind of a... Anytime, you know, grieving is going to be addressed in a high school setting, naturally Heather's comparisons are going to happen. Which would probably be happening anyway, given how they kind of have a Heather-Veronica thing going on anyway. But the way it approaches, like, you know, grieving, not just grieving in school, but like kind of a grieving throughout the town. When it's like the initial fire and then the subsequent deaths. But then the idea of like grieving being a passing fad is something that's very interesting and sort of biting in a way that I wish the movie wasn't. Obviously not just literally, but like in that sort of satirical approach of how these things are portrayed. But it doesn't really feel like there's like it doesn't take near as much of a bite out of it as it probably could have, and especially under Cody, definitely could have, but didn't. So yeah, so really, I just kind of feel like it's clear what its mark is, but it really feels like it misses. Like it's surprising to me that it took the Weinstein era of scandals for people to come around on it and say, "Oh, that movie was saying something." It feels like it's pretty much there, but it's like pretty out in the open. But I just feel like that it's so underwhelming as far as its execution of that, and just its execution in general as a horror movie. Just really falls short of what it could have been. And the whole idea of like how we talked about with Teeth, in the other movies, how eventually there's a point where horror movies really embrace their crazy. I never really feel like, and Jennifer's Body feels like the kind of movie that is absolutely ready to embrace crazy and will have those moments, but like it's like even the stuff where she's like, you know, puking the black and stuff like that, and the way like her mouth opens up. I mean, there is some stuff in here that's probably iconic in certain circles, like, you know, Jennifer's look post the prom or dance or whatever it is at the end. But it's like I said, I see a lot of setup and potential for this to have been something really great and memorable. But while it does, it's for sure got a cult following, and I think even had a cult following before all the scandals hit and before people started saying it had a certain importance to it. But it's, I don't know, I feel like it just doesn't quite get there with all of the stuff that it's trying to do, and like I said, embracing the crazy in the way something like Teeth does, where it's able to do that but also take itself seriously but also not, depending on the right times, and finding that balance and tone. And yeah, so like I said, there's something great, you know, in this movie, but it really struggles to come out in its execution. So that's kind of unfortunate, and I think that's why it sort of just kind of came and went when it first came out. And while I can certainly see these elements a bit more in it, where it seems like it has more to say and more than just what its advertising put out, it still just kind of feels like a relatively forgettable horror movie to me. While I can still acknowledge what's underneath it. So I think that's pretty much where I can leave this. So we're getting a whole bunch of these all at once still. Like 3 or 4 more verses right here in this particular group that I'm shooting all at once, and then talking about the 6th Tremors movie and the new releases of Last Night in Soho and Antlers should be around the corner as well. So yeah, so until we get to that stuff, I think that's it.